Hello, and thanks for joining us for the Friends of the Farm lecture series. Each session is designed to deliver an in-depth dose of cannabis education. I'm Candace Hawes, and I want to thank all of our viewers and customers from the pharmacy, from the pottery, from the Natural Healing Center, and from all of our friends watching us from all over the world. Today, we have a great webinar for you, and we're going to be discussing a topic that comes up a lot at dispensaries and a lot in industry circles, which is the belief that many people have that high THC numbers correlate to a higher quality cannabis. This drives a lot of us crazy, and we see it happening all the time. So that's why I was really excited to bring Nate on to discuss this further. So he's going to talk about how he believes that, cannabis and high THC rates, the high THC rate does not correlate to the quality or effect of the cannabis. I've known Nate for many years, and I was always found him to be an incredible source of information and a great resource when I have questions about testing or something high level cannabis. He has a lot of knowledge. I've known him in the cannabis industry, and he's always been so willing to share his information. Nate Winokur is the Vice President of Strategy and Operations at BelCosta Labs, one of California's principal licensed cannabis testing facilities, comprised of nationally renowned experts in the cannabis field who are dedicated to driving growth in the science community. Nate has been involved and a passionate member of the cannabis community for over 19 years. In 2011, Nate began working for a large-scale cannabis laboratory where he was instrumental in bringing cannabis science and lab testing to Southern California. Nate built this operation from a single employee to a fully functioning lab of 18 employees. And after a couple of years in 2016, he ventured out on his own to assist in extraction labs with their build out, development, process, flow, and optimizations to produce quality products. This led led him to help develop and launch the next level of cannabis analytics, combining perfected analytical methods, re-engineered operating system, customized technology, and then BelCosta Labs was born. Based in Long Beach, California, BelCosta Labs is groundbreaking with a fast turnaround times, consistent true science, competitive pricing, and deeply rooted understanding of cannabis. They have quickly risen to an overnight success story and the beacon of what Cannabis Future Lab should be. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nate.
Let me get us off of the mic. Yeah, there we go. Thank you so much. It's good to see you too, Candace. It's been forever. I feel like we get caught up in the busyness and the rigmarole of everything. And I mean, here we are. So I hope you've been awesome. What's up to you and your family? What's up to all of you out there? And keep the locations coming from the chat. That's amazing to know how far, this is reaching at the moment. So yes, please. And thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it, Candace. Happy to be here and talking to everybody tonight, and hopefully informative AF. So let me know if you guys have any questions or if anything comes up. And you're here for the whole time, Candace?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'll be here kind of moderating. You can go ahead and scroll through the slides yourself by putting your mouse over the slides. You can move it back and forward. And then I'll just be monitoring the chat here and come back at the end with some questions. So please, Nate, present your wonderful information to the group.
Awesome. Appreciate it. One more question. How much time again? I know we went through this, but.
Yeah, it's an hour. So around 7 o'clock it should wrap.
All right. It gives me an idea of how long per slide and all that stuff. Thank you. And awesome. And thank you guys so much. As Candace mentioned, I'm one of the principals, one of the guys running BelCosta Labs, fastest growing lab, fortunately, pretty much ever. It's an analytical laboratory. So I am the guy who studies, cannabinoids, terpenes. That's the fun stuff. The other 80% of my job is studying all the ways that cannabis can fail, all of the heavy metals and pesticides of the world. So it's all right. Sometimes I get to be, right in the middle of all the awesomeness, cannabis information like tonight. Sometimes I get to be the messenger of bad news. That's a large part of my job too, but that's how it goes. And that's cannabis science for you. So yeah, let's get started. And I'm going to try to use this little kind of slide. All right, there it goes. Well, thank you guys for coming for my lecture on high THC fallacy. It's a big thing that I've been talking about recently. A lot of labs out there, for what it's worth. No need to delve into, the culture of, how things work and don't work always in the industry. But a lot of labs have found success in telling people not the truth, but just telling people what they want to hear. Unfortunately, this has led to this weird upside down race to the bottom where, I can't even tell you the highest THC I've yet to see applied, but it's in the 50% range, which is just bonkers. And that's not only indicative of, the need to really showing people's need to stand out and ways to be able to actually show standing out in this industry. But also, it really shows that people are trying to show quality through this chemical component that's not really meant to show quality. Now, one of the best and biggest examples I have that I kind of always go back to in terms of understanding cannabis and understanding what quality means is what makes something top shelf. And here's kind of my intro here for you guys. Have you ever heard of top shelf wine and spirit producers touting the highest potency of alcohol? No. Well, what do they talk about? They talk about a balance of flavors, right? They talk about chemical balances. If you've ever heard something about nice wine or wine tasting, they'll often mention tannins, ketones, a balance of esters and flavonoids and other chemicals that are present. They do have an alcohol content. The alcohol content, of course, is important, but the highest, if you went to a winery and you asked them for the best stuff and followed that question with, can you give me the stuff with the highest alcohol content? They'd, bring you aside and tell you you're doing it wrong. So, this is something that doesn't, that's not avoided in the idea of cannabis either. It really is something that needs to be considered, because any consideration of this idea is just absolutely, steering into the wrong way of understanding what makes quality. So what we're here to talk about. Cannabis has always been understood as something complex. The chemical profile, the experience, and the quality of the high all support what we cannabis professionals know. There's a lot to this plant. When many of us saw a focus on THC from the early days, we knew there had to be more to it. Before long, we did find quite a bit more: additional cannabinoids, terpenes, and other volatile organic compounds, the works. However, this has left us with a quandary that is yet to be answered. How can this complex plant be explained to the market in the most non-complex way? The mass market is very much still maturing, and a significant number of cannabis consumers took part in the traditional industry, including myself, where things were very hit and miss a lot of the time. Consumers felt they had to get smarter to avoid the inconsistencies they often saw in cannabis. Even today, those same mindsets still permeate buying decisions. Some companies took note of what helped direct these buying decisions, and many started to compare the THC content from their products to other batches. There was a lack of understanding the nuances of cannabis and what makes it special. This could be directly seen in the demand for strains in the Kush family, whose THC numbers aren't normally high. Normally highly reviewed strains like these, like Bubba Kush, for instance, were getting picked over in favor of high THC producers. So, Candace, if it's okay to take a quick break, how long has it been? Well, number one, you've been in cannabis as long as I have.
Yeah.
I'm coming on 24 years. I think you're right about there, too. So, a long time. Remember Bubba Kush?
Yeah, I do. And we don't see it really anymore.
How long has it been since you've seen it? Well, because it's 12% on a good day. But everybody remembers Bubba Kush. I've given this lecture numerous times of, in terms of just, private groups and stuff like that. And I always stop right here and say to everybody, remember Bubba Kush? And they're like, yeah, what happened to it? I said, it didn't make it anybody's standards because everybody was hyper focusing on THC and not on what actually makes something good. If you were looking for the very best wine and you went for the very top quality of wine or top potency of wine, you'd end up with a port, a dessert wine, right? You're doing it wrong. There's so much more that you're missing. And that's a huge point that I look to kind of drive into this. Simply spoken, potency and consistency is not the same. And potency and high potency high potency and high quality are not the same thing.
That's really interesting how you pointed out the history, though, and how we kind of trained ourselves to think this way and how we've actually, not really helped us make the best choices.
we created in our minds without really anybody telling us, but mathematically it makes sense. We sort of created this market value, like when you go and buy meat at the market, they have a fair market value that could change depending on the supply and demand curves of everything. And so cannabis, so often people think works like this, and in some ways it does, like the buying and selling of large quantities of distilled cannabis concentrate. But when we talk about high quality flower, we're so far off that base right there that it's not even a part of the same idea. So when we have the idea of what made us a smart consumer back in the day, and now we have lab testing right here, we think lab testing is there to make us a smart consumer, but we're just hyper focusing on this one quality instead of really looking at the plant holistically, and that's what's missing. So let me slide back a little bit because I just got on my own little rant. Sorry, got a kitty attacking right here.
They love webinars.
Yeah, right. Always makes me feel like, like I'm supposed to be scheming on something right there with a kitty in my lap. Anyhow, potency is not the same as consistency. This is the first real part of the lecture, guys. So allow me to go on a well-constructed tangent right here. Potency is not consistency. When you see potency written on a container of cannabis, what does it say? Does the value of the THC match what's inside the container? Is it supposed to match what's inside the container? Example, let's say you have a 25% THC container. So let me just kind of bring everything to this point. You go to a cannabis store, you're purchasing some, or you're well aware of what the percentage is published on a particular batch of cannabis that you happen to be buying. And in this case, it's a 25% batch. Let's say this 25% total THC that you see on the container right there, you're wonder to yourself, is this the amount that's the true value of the cannabis in the container? And you have to say, no, this is the value of the entire batch. But why is this important? To explain how this works in the commercial market, think of cannabis like oranges. In both cases, you have an agricultural fruit, basically. We call one flower, but, essentially we're looking at the budding fruit of the product. When you buy some oranges, you end up with a lot of variance, even within a single bag. That's not such a big deal when you end up thinking about it. Has anybody here ever bought a bag of oranges? Naturally. And when you've bought this bag of oranges, naturally some of these oranges turn out to be juicy, some dry, some in between. There's a lot of variance inside of there, just within a single bag. If you were to have a juicy orange within that bag and then a dry orange following that, would you think that the orange manufacturer or orange packager is scheming you? Oh, there she goes. Would you think that you're being schemed, that there's somebody kind of playing you right there? Or would you just simply say that that's the nature of oranges, of organic fruit in general? And maybe you kind of see the point that I'm going to be trying to drive home. Come on, kitty. The point that I'm trying to drive home with cannabis. She's cute, but she tries to get it. You'll notice that some of these oranges will be juicy, some will be dry, some will be big, some will be small, and some will be in between. Cannabis works, much in the same way. It's another organic fruit. Sure, it tends to be a little bit more expensive than your average orange, but it's not privy to different rules. Sometimes one bud smokes better than another. Sometimes one orange is more sour than another. Sometimes they both came off the same tree, and that simply spoken, one tree is bound to have some levels of variance. Could you imagine in some crazy world if you took a bunch of oranges off an orange tree and squeezed them all out and they all squeezed out to the exact same level of juice? That would be the twilight zone. That's not normal. That's not natural. That's not how things normally go. You'll notice some of these oranges, back to the presentation, will be juicy, some will be dry, some big and some small, some in between. On average, a single orange yields 75 milliliters of juice. It would be very weird if every orange yielded the same amount of juice. To drive that point home. Cannabis is an organic product, much like oranges. Also, like oranges, it's not supposed to have the same chemical content in each part. It's normal to see a fair amount of chemical variance in organic products. These are realistic numbers from the same batch. How do I know that? We've actually tested this kind of thing where we've tested cannabis from not only the same batch, but from the same plant. And it has a 20% swing in either direction. And it's totally normal. So when you consider this, there's some dry oranges and there's some juicy oranges, right? Anywho, it's normal to see this level of swing. Also, bear in mind that when my samplers come in and do their various picks, when it comes time for testing, the buds are randomly picked and will be homogenized at the laboratory. In this example, all right, you're not good for another pass, Kevin. This example, they would yield an overall batch potency of 25%. And you can see that happening there. We pick in this, kind of chart, not exactly how the picks go, but you would see five different buds. We would take these all back to the lab. We'd homogenize it into just one, formless mass. And from there, we would be taking our samples. And from that, we'd be able to determine what not the top or the bottom quality is, but what the overall sort of potency would be from all of these. So if that's the case, is it possible for you as a cannabis buyer who goes into a dispensary or wherever have you, is it possible for one of the lesser potency buds to be what you received from your cannabis purchase? You bet. That's crazy if you think about it, because there's when so many people go, and there's even lawsuits out there right now with people with this exact same thing happening. Literally, I saw one out there with a major cannabis company in California, and it was a 5% swing. So something labeled at 25% in this example, and you getting a 20% bud, although I presented it right here as perfectly matter of fact, it makes wonderful sense. There's literally somebody getting sued right now, a large scale company, for this exact same thing with this exact same frame of numbers. So if that's the case, is it possible for you to get one of those lesser potency buds? Sure. Is it possible for you to get one of the higher potency buds? Totally. What can we do about this weird quandary as we also look at this? Technically nothing. It's the nature of cannabis. The only way to get closer to guaranteeing the chemical consistency of your cannabis and your purchase matches the jar labeling would be through even smaller batches. Currently, the max batch size for flower, say that 10 times fast, in California is 50 pounds, which really isn't that big. Consider that it's not, part of Glasshouse here. Glasshouse, I can't even tell you how many times over they have to chop down one batch to get it to work into 50-pound increments. I can see you guys growing thousands of pounds at once, and you don't even have the option of testing them all at once. Literally have to throw 20, 40 tests at single batches, and that's just mind-blowing. So to that point, the only way to guarantee that would be through even smaller batches, which is even more insane than, what's blowing this dude's mind. Or you could also purchase more. But that would only increase the probability of receiving both the highest and the lowest, if you're thinking about it, that the batch has to offer. Realistically, we simply need education to know that THC isn't everything, and not every morsel will be chemically similar. So this may seem super straightforward in this, but in real time, people are being sued for it. I can't tell you how impactful it is, that bad information, just a bad concept and consideration of THC and what it means, even from bud to bud, is just from if you consider the cola at the top of a plant, just from the top of the cola to the bottom of the cola are two different chemical consistencies. So often people tell me that they've sent buds from the same batch to two different labs, and they get different results back, and they think that testing is bunk as a result. Like, no, that's like taking two different oranges and then sending them to two different places and being surprised when they didn't come back telling you it didn't have the same amount of juice in each one. Not how nature works.
Yep. Good point.
What can you use to tell your cannabis is high quality? And kind of open up that question. So here I am bashing on THC. I intend to give you guys a solution, not just, THC bashing. As itchy as it gets. Excuse me. In recent years, we've seen a regression in the understanding of cannabis amongst the market, driven by unidimensional assumptions. Unidimensional assumptions is my nice way of saying, high THC can go to really cat. I have a couple. I didn't think this would be an issue. All right, my bad.
No worries. Got a fan club over there.
They know what's up, you know?
I put the slide back for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, he loves the keyboard. It warmer. I don't know, whatever. Back to focus. To tell seasoned cannabis professionals that high THC implies high quality product is like telling Napa winemakers, you can see my pattern here, that their product is inferior to wines with a higher ABV, alcohol by volume, which simply isn't the case. Much like our craft winemaking peers, we have the ability to distill what makes a top shelf cannabis product, a chemically balanced, enjoyable experience. We know what to look for, and what's more, we can use science to light the way. Consumers want what's special, and we've actually had a chance through focus groups to be able to help determine this. To kind of craft it a little further, though, as leaders in the industry, we, the royal we, listeners included, can help control the narrative in a direction where, much like our craft wine friends, the market can understand what sets craft cannabis products apart. By reviewing the chemical profile and installing simple systems, the industry and its fans can view the chemical profile in ways that have yet to be utilized. Consumers should be given what they need to make a good decision rather than steering them into a void of THC-focused misinformation. So there's a new term. A lot of you guys, I'm sure, have heard the term entourage effect. Ever since a few years ago, I found when THC was said to be getting too much of a focus in the industry, and how the sciences needed to take a step back, and everybody needed to look at various chemical components in the plant. There's a huge area that's kind of budded, if you will, from that kind of mindset. And one of the call signs of that has been the notion of an ensemble effect rather than an entourage effect, to help explain the sort of similarity in terms of each term. Entourage was suggesting that THC was sort of the main star, and it had this entourage of other chemicals that kind of kept it tamed and created the overall effect that we saw and loved and learned about and all of that. The idea of an ensemble means that there's not necessarily a main player, however, that it's really an orchestrated effect of everything coming together that you're feeling. And in that's where to see the most importance in terms of cannabis, and how it is going to most helpfully and most holistically, again, to be viewed in a way that's going to allow us to understand it, and its therapies and its enjoyments and everything that people love about it in the best way.
I like that. I like the change from an entourage to ensemble. It makes complete sense.
And in the ensemble, it was nice to see some attention being given to other compounds. But it's, we need to move it so much more the other way. We see in California still 99% of what's sold, more than 99% of what's sold. I venture to say 99.9% of what's sold is high THC product. And so that's, really selling our favorite plant short.
Yeah.
The ensemble effect refrains the entire discussion. We're dismissing the notion that THC is the headliner and the other compounds are the side acts. Ensemble of compounds contribute to the overall experience. Ergo, we are determining what chemical indicators in our industry define a quality product. What's more, we've taken steps, such as through my focus groups, to prove it. Is nothing new. Craft wine focuses on a balanced chemical profile. Again, they'll refer to things as a balance of so many chemicals and alongside the alcohol content, rather than showing one type of chemical chiefing the other ones. That, if anything, in the craft world actually talks about an imbalance, and that's what we're ultimately kind of bumping closer to, is how do we actually determine these balances. And so look at my banner, look towards the terpenes. Terps are the true north of cannabis quality. Looking at more than just the THC gives you a better idea of what you're about to enjoy. Hence the first system I'd like to suggest to you guys, which is the THC to terpene ratio. Pretty easy for everybody to be able to help look at and calculate in their own. Dividing the THC over the terpenes presents a way of being able to actually show what a balanced chemical content looks like. Interestingly enough, and again, per focus group, people tend to enjoy this when the terps are higher and THC is lower. And things like Bubba Kush fit really well into this scoring system well, whereas something that is generally very, very high in THC doesn't as much. Well, it can, but high in THC, but low in flavor tends not to. As we get into this, and again, I keep mentioning the focus groups. It's kind of interesting, Candace, but do you know what people called a high THC product that was low in terps when they were, being blind testing? When they were blind testing it, they were smoking without knowing what the THC or terps were. Would you be interested to know that they all called it harsh? Every single
Interesting.
high THC, low terps, harsh, which I think is actually not that crazy when you consider it. Because if you have, say, a bad alcohol that's just a hugely high alcohol content but doesn't
Yeah.
offer much in the way of flavor, how would you call it? It's pretty harsh, right?
Yeah, like a
And
cheap vodka or something you might buy, like cheap, high alcohol content, like at the grocery store or something. Doesn't taste
harsh.
very good, you know?
It's harsh. It's not a good experience. And so when people make a buying decision, and more important, a rebuy decision, and what actually drives them to say, oh my God, that was flipping amazing. What is that? What did you just give me? This is actually a much closer scale of what somebody would respond to than what you think by just looking at high THC per focus group. So again, this pretty awesome data that we were able to get from that. So there's a new concept for describing potency and quality of a strain beyond just THC results. In first model, you see how a 25% strain with an above average terpene profile, 2.5% would appear, which shows as 10 to 1. So my little race gauge right there shows that it's amongst the terpiest ones. And how a 35% strain with an average terpene profile, 1.5%, would appear, which is out there. But honestly, people, when they have a chance to try it next to something that's generally juicier, it doesn't ring as being the same level, the same quality.
Mm-hmm.
This concept explains how to confirm a product is chemically balanced by highlighting the relationship between the cannabinoids and the terpenes. So it's nothing really to suggest you should look at one. No, look at the other. Look at both of them. There's nothing that says one is better than the other. Just like wine, look for that balance, right? This is that balance. Ironically, a lower ratio is, rather than high THC, this is a low end of things. A lower ratio, a lower number is actually going to denote a higher quality. THC to terp ratio is intuitive to what makes a high quality cannabis product, as opposed to highlighting the THC alone, which would fall short. How do I know this is accurate? I arranged and organized focus groups specifically for finding data to bridge consumer decision making with cannabis profiles. And again, if you're wondering how this all came to be, it's because as a cannabis professional, as somebody who runs a lab who didn't want to play that high THC game, with everybody, it's an imaginary contest, where you print bad data. I didn't want to charge people hundreds of dollars for printing bad data onto a piece of paper. They're getting ripped off. Like, no, nothing's happening. That would be a good thing there. I realized I didn't want to participate in this, and I knew there had to be something else, because I knew that a lot of the cannabis that I like to smoke doesn't happen to always fall into the high THC category. Bubba Kush being a fantastic example. So I looked for this, and what did I find? Found that high THC or terpenes alone did not lead to the perception of a high quality strain. Much more terps, though. The highest rated strain was the one with the best and most balance, which was the lowest THC to terpene profile. THC to terpene ratioed profile. And the lowest rated strain was the one with the highest THC to terpene profile. So I was able to actually predict, essentially, with everybody's ratings, what was going to be the winner and the loser based on which one had the most balanced flavors versus which one had the greatest lack of balance. And that was my simple conclusion there. A better balanced THC to terpene ratio predicts a better experience. There was a strain in California last year that was around for about a month before it got bought up and never seen again, because it got bought up so quickly and nobody regrew it because they saw low numbers. But they swore, and it was a pretty well-known one. It came from Node Labs, and it was called Pez Sours. And Pez Sours hit the shelves, and everybody bought it up, even though it only hit 20, maybe 21% THC on a good day. But when you compared it to this scale, it was very, very terpy. It was very juicy, had a moderate amount of THC. 21% isn't bad, but lower than average and what most people perceive to be the average. And everybody ate it up, and nobody really knew why. And the sad thing is that nobody ended up regrowing it, and everybody just sent it straight to flower because nobody really understood what they had their hands on. Just a fantastic example of what people actually respond so well to, but without even knowing it. So we applied the same formulas. Isn't that crazy? I mean, slow down and look at the data, it screams, the opposite of what so many people perceive, hence high THC fallacy, right?
Yep. I like to surprise myself personally, and I'll buy based on terpenes or the nose, not even look at the THC percentage. And then after I try it, and I'm really impressed by something, I'll sometimes look in the 20s, so it's amazing. And so I completely agree. Everything that you found in your focus group is things that I found as well.
100%. Yeah. And thank you for that backup and confirmation. Yeah, that's how it goes. It's absolutely nuts because it's such a difference than literally 100% of the buying decisions that happen every day. Yes. And you wouldn't normally think this, but there it is. So we were working, sorry, I lost my spot. We applied the same formulas to common strains, and through our ongoing work in the field, we've begun cataloging strains in the same manner. We're seeking to familiarize the community with their products using this novel approach, and to propose that we popularize the use of science-forward systems to help educate and communicate to the consumer base. And so here are some new ways of looking at cannabis products. So right here, these are all what we consider to be common. These all within the last year have been released through Compound Genetics and Node Labs. They dictate some of the most common strains that you tend to see in the industry, including gelato and all sorts of other ones. So they're behind a lot, and they've demonstrated a really good use for being able to show on the general side of this. So, oops, went too fast. So you can see, a few just strains, just kind of keep a lookout for those guys right there. We'll cover some of these numbers in a little bit.
Nice.
But you can see a few of these that are out there. Some are terpier than others. Now, there are some other interesting ones that are out there. Banana strains usually get rated really highly, and I think it's really good. It's really important to point out for a lot of banana strains that we don't actually really get to read a big part of the profile. I love banana strains, by the way. It's some of my favorite smoke experiences. Would you be interested to know, Candace, that if you showed me, say, a banana OG, and then a standard, just run-of-the-mill OG, and if I ran those two different strains through my lab as terpene tests, they wouldn't actually show up any differently. They'd be essentially identical. Wow. Surprising, right? Everybody's surprised by that information. Why is that? Why would the presence of banana, which we could say is one of the dominating flavor, at least when I've had it before, so why isn't this banana showing up in the terp profile? It's not actually a terpene. It's an ester, isoamyl acetate. It's fun to say too. This is the same chemical that's produced by apple bananas, maybe produced by banana trees in their bananas. And our very favorite plant has the ability to synthesize this same chemical and have this chemical produced, and they were able to find it. It's really interesting, right?
It's really cool. Yeah.
So isoamyl acetate is an ester, and as interesting as it is, when you do look at the flavor profile, especially of an ester strong strain like a banana strain, you actually don't really get a full picture of it through the terpene profile. I'm driving, the science leadership of my lab for what it's worth to try to hopefully one day soon, as early as this year, go beyond terps. Flavonoids are fairly close and accessible, and I've challenged them within this year to see if they can do flavonoids and esters. I would love to see both of those, because I think that would have, especially for not only bananas, but let's just throw for the apples out there, which you see here as well as strawberry strains. You'll get so many different types of so many different types of expressions of cannabis. It's also interesting to know that if we had started studying esters before we started studying terpenes, we'd all be sitting here determining what makes the best type of strain based on how appley it is or how banana like it is and stuff like that. Quick question. Are any of these strains available in the Sacramento/Bay Area? Yes, quite a few. I know that the is it okay to drop the name of
Yeah.
other operations. I know Connected Alien Labs uses in a huge way dips into Node Labs and Compound Genetics. But if you'd like, look into Node Labs and Compound Genetics. Those are who actually produce those strains, and there are numerous grow operations all across the state, even country, in a lot of senses, where they have these. So up in the Sacramento and Bay Area, yeah, Connected Alien Labs will have some of those, and across
most dispensaries, I would say, across the whole state.
I was going to say, just reach out to Node Labs, Compound Genetics, and find out where their stuff is this year. They've got to make it easy for people to find and purchase through their products. I'll be able to show you in just a moment how special some strains out there can be, depending on how they're being presented and all that fun stuff. And that's through mapping the chemical profiles of cannabis, which is the next part. 3 years of studying cannabis chemical profiles and a strong understanding of cannabis, I've developed novel systems that have been in the works for years and are beginning to emerge. We at BelCosta have a unique lens in our understanding of cannabis and what makes it special, and have discovered that the chemical profiles can be aligned together while still showing their complex differences using a table built along the cannabis chemical spectrum. Different categories emerge in the study of cannabis, dictated by their chemical profiles. Many consumers and professionals also apply anecdotal and effects-based designations to these categories. I don't personally. I kind of like just sticking to the chemical categorizations rather than telling you happy, awake, and sleepy and all of that fun stuff.
Yeah.
But and because again, I take my cues from in a lot of ways, craft winemakers and craft beer makers. They'll tell you what's in it, what makes it, but nobody's ever going to distill vodka and then call it mean drink. You know what I mean? Like they're going to leave that up to the drinker, or they, enjoy to be able to make those kind of determinations.
Yes.
There are relationships between many of these strains in these profiles, often through the crossing of strains and hybridization. What we have done differently is collect all of the relevant strain data in one spot and made it intuitive and easy to read. So here's one way of being able to explain this. This is late last year's profiles for Node Labs Compound Genetics. And so what are we looking at here? This is a chart, a table that I've developed. It's essentially a spectrum because it shows not only some of these strains, but crosses between these strains. And let me explain. Number one, let me just kind of help you guys find your bearing on my graph here. I have the THC from top to bottom. It's listed on the left, and you can see those various areas and margins it fits into. I have the terpene content perceived, or more appropriately, the THC to terpene ratio, indicated on a scale based on essentially the bubble size. And a larger bubble, as it appears on the main graph, would indicate a lower THC to terpene ratio, or a more appropriately flavored product, a more balanced product. What we have here, and in a very easy to understand, in my opinion, way, is to look at the left three columns. We see the Kush family, what we call the desserts, and the OG gas kind of family there. What's neat about these is that we can make determinations about what the when we study a strain, about which category it belongs to in, because I can run terpene and cannabinoid profile, and I can essentially find where it ends up. For instance, if it has a high myrcene content and, secondarily, although much lower beta caryophyllene and other terps, almost always points out something in the Kush, or what we often consider an indica. At the same time, if it's got beta caryophyllene or high amounts of beta caryophyllene and limonene, those are the indicators for an OG, which we see all the time. It's the main, that's by far the dominant types of strain that we test. Next, what we're able to do is see some real interesting crosses between the two. And I'm going to move back to this guy in a second. But let me give us a little bit more of an overlay. So I mentioned late 2022 strains. This is now the previous season, early 2022 strains overlaid. And you can see a few more of their options, but very much things grouping together. Now, what kind of emerges here when you look at some things is, for instance, look at Girl Scout cookies. That's one of the new ones that appeared in the light blue, smack dab in the middle. I'm able to tell how far to the middle it is or how off center that one is because I'm able to look at the terpene profile. I'm able to look to see what the dominant strain leaders are, be it OG and gas, or when it's crossed with Kushes, which generally, there's a lot of theories out there, but I can tell you from studying this stuff and looking at it, OG and Kush is crossed constantly and back crossed against itself constantly. And that's essentially what makes what we consider to be the dessert category. People have various ideas on what makes a particular strain, but I'm here to tell you that cannabis creates a very certain specific order to it. And even when you cross two weird strains and you expect something very crazy to pop out, generally speaking, it goes right into a known category. And you can see right here from numerous types of strains being crossed and trying to understand, they gather right into certain clusters, right?
Yeah.
What's interesting about these clusters and how they move, though, is I can actually see inside of the dessert category. I can resolve the difference between something like the dog walker right there that's on the right, that's more OG right there, or the big apples, which has some indications of Kush, versus something that has a higher myrcene contents like the Girl Scout cookies. We have the opportunity to be able to see a lot of these in terms of what the dominating qualities are that come from the genetics. I'm going to bring this up on one other screen here so I can see everything a little larger. There we go. So when we look at something like the squeeze, for instance, kind of interesting on this chart. That's the one right at the dessert and top middle. Kind of dry, but very much of a 50-50 between the Kush and the OG gas. That's one of those desserts that really express about the same amount of chemicals that indicate it being a Kush as indicate it being an OG and so forth. Also, we can see what some of those outliers are. And let me go back to the previous slide that we have that kind of pointed those out. Those outliers are really interesting. Now you can see where the market focus is. When I say market focus, what do I mean? 95% of the cannabis that I test is right there inside of that red line. That's crazy.
Yeah.
What about sativas? All sativas, everything in the sativa kingdom, make up about 2% of what I test, all of them put together.
Wow.
Right? 95% of what I test is right there. So that's crazy. But would you be surprised to know that the highest THC producers on this whole chart will essentially be right there? We'll cover that in a moment too, because
we'll be in the market focus area or in the outliers,
in the market, generally spoken, in the market focus area. This is, to Node Labs and their benefit, they're not just looking for things in the market focus area. They've actually been able to create some other high THC strains in the outliers area. Those are very unique chemical combinations that you see right there. The myrcene, linalool, ocimene lead. In fact, we don't see very many ocimene leads in strains these days. It's a hempy chemical. And in this way, they created something that is a high THC variant of something that is much more land racy indica like, and something that has a much more of a different profile. And for what it's worth, if you guys see any of these, the gastropops or the glitter bombs, they tend to, in my humble opinion, knock your socks off. Not because they've a high THC, but because they're so different and such a unique chemical profile than what we would normally see. By reviewing charts like this, we're able to see how things are related to one another, and we're able to see how things differentiate. Now, this is a Humboldt operation right here that I did a bunch of tests for, and this is a whole pheno hunting project that they did. And this one gives you a much better idea because they didn't have so much of a focus or an understanding of what they're doing. They just kind of threw everything at it and what came up. You can see where the market focus is on this one. And I added additional columns because why would I show columns for somebody and just make them empty, right? So this gives you a little bit more of that kind of spectral graph that goes on in a much more robust sort of format now that we've seen some other stuff. Now you can see, I think really interestingly, you see the pyramid that's forming here as things capitalize and go up to the market focus. When you just throw anything at it, that's what you generally see is right there in that OG cross, the desserts, and especially the OG leaning dessert category. That's where you see most of the potency. Now, there's something else that I've sought to create here in making this system, and I'm been doing a lot of lectures on this to try to improve these ideas and try to get them in front of everybody. But you keep hearing me talk about wine, and especially wine, things like beer and stuff like that. You guys ever go out for a wine tasting? Of course you have, right? Mm-hmm. You ever had like a flight of wine? Of course you have. If anybody hasn't, all good. Let me give you a good understanding of what that is. You would sit down at a counter and something like a winery or a brewery, for the sake of beer, would give you a number of selections of what they offer. They would encourage you not to come in and just drink the most alcoholic of the offerings that they have. They would encourage you to come in and sit down and drink, say, 5 or 6 of the offerings. Very frequently, the idea of that flight has been predetermined, and sometimes they'll even give you this helpful piece of construction paper that has a printout on it that gives you a little explanation of everything that you're about to drink. Sometimes it's on a nice little wooden tray, and you'll have said construction paper or a little menu spread out across. And here is that for cannabis right here, that when you take this idea and really express it out. In my vision and in my dream, and again, what high THC fallacy has unfortunately led us to is a hyper focus. Again, 95% of what I test is right there. But how much more cannabis is there? How many more expressions are there? What does high THC essentially do? It leads us to kind of just looking at one certain chemical, for the most part, one chemical profile of what produces high THC. It doesn't actually give us the true breadth of cannabis. Now, does cannabis deserve that? Hell no. Are there ways to being able to express cannabis? Yeah, I would love, and I mean love, nothing more than to sit down at a counter where I can have every expression you see right here, and the strain name categories have changed a few times. If you would call it something else, that's awesome. Let me know. But from herbaceous to cushy all the way to fresh and fruity, we have so many different expressions of cannabis. And if you're just looking at high THC, you'd be missing so many. Just like if you sat down at a winery and you said, only give me the highest ABV, they put a port in front of you, just the dessert wine. And yeah, you're doing it wrong. And yeah, you would miss 90% of what they have. Maybe I'm blowing that up. 80% easily of what they have to offer by just simply focusing on one chemical aspect that really shouldn't be focused on, in my humble opinion. Yeah, sure, it's there. I mean, I would maybe, if I have high THC, call that my dessert strain. That's what I want to go to bed with, because that's going to give me the deepest sleep and the best dreams. But if I'm hanging out with friends, just like you're not reaching for Everclear to hang out with them, maybe you want some decent alcohol because you haven't seen these people in a while and you like them and you want to enjoy something with them. It's not a weird thing to want to enjoy cannabis in the same way, in my humble opinion. Realistically, close my door, sorry.
I love that analogy, though. It's so true, it helps people really understand this concept.
Thank you. And yeah, it's been on my mind for a minute, and by all means, we should enjoy all these agricultural fruits, if you will, and renditions of these fruits. And this is at the very top of being able to understand cannabis for everything it is. If we focus on just one chemical aspect, then we're really going to miss out on a lot of what the plant has. I'm sure most people here have heard of the idea of pheno hunting. And if not, it's the idea of going out amongst the planet and trying to find every last expression and experience of cannabis, because this amazing plant can provide so much for us and so much beauty. And if I had to tell you about that conceptually, then the conceptual opposite of that would be buying for just high THC, right? Because you're limiting yourself. Look right there at the screen. You're limiting yourself to really one main chemical profile. That's not going to do you any good. Not if in terms of loving cannabis, not in terms of loving all the different variations of it. High THC, sure, that's neat. But I mean, I wouldn't look at high THC any more than looking to see what the chemical category is that we're going to be smoking. Because isn't that important too? Just as much. Because let's say if it's something like a Kush, of course it wouldn't be as high as an OG. Does this mean that OGs and Kushes are the same thing, but OG is just better? No, they're completely different experiences. And you'd be missing this entirely if you were buying just based on high THC.
Yep.
So, how are cannabinoid and terpene potency measured? We have compliance batches are picked up by a sampler prior to the point of being studied, and always in multiple increment samples. This means that multiple parts of the same batch from the lab will be reflected by the results, providing a statistically relevant cross-section. All samples will be homogenized thoroughly prior to testing. Exceptions are microbial testing of foreign materials, which is being sought after and can become compromised by homogenizing and therefore be undetectable. So we always check those out first. And these steps were developed in working with the DCC, the Department of Cannabis Control, it used to be the BCC, the Bureau of Cannabis Control, and our ISO requirements, and we're an ISO accredited laboratory as well. Every method must be approved in advance of being used. So for quality testing, which like I said, I'd love for that to be all I do, but it's only a small part of it. Cannabinoids and terpenes are the two best available measurements of cannabis quality for naturally grown or minimally processed products, such as high quality extractions. Both can be measured by an analytical laboratory, such as myself. A high pressure or high performance liquid chromatography instrument, or HPLC, is used for cannabinoids, and a gas chromatography instrument with flame ionization detection, or a GCFID, is used for terpene analysis. High terpene content typically is the greatest bearing in cannabis flower, being considered to be high quality, usually. So I bring these about to just kind of humanize the testing process. It's just people making dilutions, excuse me, for the most part. It's just my techs making dilutions, making extractions and diluted amounts of these extractions and feeding them to these instruments. For potency, prep and instrumentation involves an HPLC. Sample reflects the homogenized cross-section of a batch, maybe up to 80 grams flour. So if a 50-pound batch, we take 0.35% of that, that calculates out to 80 grams. The product is extracted much like manufacturing setting. Solvents is methanol in this case. Sample will be tested in its diluted and methanol extracted liquid form. Industry uses this for labeling and safety. You know, if you consider what this is in its most solid form, this is to label things properly. This is to make sure that an edible has the number of milligrams on it that it says it does, so nobody's going to inadvertently overdose on edibles, overconsume, or be counting on a certain amount of relief or therapy coming from, say, an edible, and inadvertently then underdosing and not seeing that level of therapy. So we try to avoid that. For terpenes, that goes through a GCFID, specialized extraction and headspace study, and it's important to keep samples in a form which prevents degradation until they are tested. Gas chromatography and a gas instrument is utilized. When I say headspace study, kind of neat. It's a big jar, right? It's a good size vial. You know, sample goes down here. It gets heated up by the instrument. The gases go from the bottom of the sample, where they're inside of the extract, to the top. A needle comes down yay far and just pulls from what's called the headspace of the vial, and those gases specifically are what gets introduced to the instrument and what gets studied. Kind of fun.
Yeah, it's cool.
This is great for cannabis. Industry uses it for cannabis categorization, going beyond just THC, as I'd say. And terpenes are the first of many volatile compounds that will be studied amongst esters, flavonoids, thiols, and many others that are all found in cannabis. So some fun little terpene facts before we wrap up. I think I'm on a good pace right here. I'll try to, yeah. But I've studied terpene profiles from tens of thousands of strains, and interesting trends have appeared.
Cool.
Number one, here are the top 23 terps that I study. Now, you find some really interesting stuff here. Beta caryophyllene, obviously pretty common. How often do I see that? 999 out of 1,000 strains. That's pretty damn common.
Yes.
When people always ask for why aren't you testing more terpenes, I often tell them that you don't want a lab to test more terpenes. That'll just make the terpene panel slower and make it less accurate. You want a lab like me to test esters and thiols and flavonoids and go on and on in this sense. And why I say that, look at terpene number 22 and number 23. There's cymene and eucalyptol. We know eucalyptol comes from eucalyptus trees. We even more or less know what that tastes like, right? For sure koalas do. With that said, those both appear in 1 out of 1,000 strains that we study.
Wow.
If we were to extend this panel to 30 terpenes, 40, 50 terpenes, that's amazing. I get to find the terp that shows up in 1 out of every 20,000 strains. That's not going to help anybody that much. There are a few I'd like to add, and we are actually going to be expanding this year as well as adding the flavonoids and hopefully esters. But to make a tired point, when we suggest, more terpenes, this isn't the end all be all of flavors inside of a strain. This is just the first thing that we as labs and as an industry have been able to study. Still, it's useful. And why I say that is because when you compare chemicals that we know, we're basically looking for a balance in those chemicals. When we find balances in chemicals, we know something was well grown. I'm not making that statement up. That's how pretty much literally right out of the books of craft winemaking they consider things. And then when I took that same lesson and applied it to a focus group, that's exactly what it told me as well. So nothing crazy. It's just how. Here's some more cool stuff. So anybody who wants any help visualizing a bell curve, you can just look at the percentage of flower that falls into terpene ranges. I find this graph insanely interesting. Only about 3.5% falls under 1% terps of the flower we test. Only roughly, what is that, 12-ish% that I'm seeing? 11.5, 12%-ish that we're seeing above 2.5%. Call that top shelf for the most part. And you can see where those averages are, everything between 1 and 2.5%, 2.5% being towards the very top of that curve.
I love this. This was going to be one of my questions to you too. What type of growing, indoor, greenhouse, outdoor, live soil produces the most terpenes? And so I love that you've also included that there, and that you have outdoor producing the highest amount of terpenes.
Which is interesting. Now, consider how this info goes. This wasn't painstakingly ripped by, a human being over the, research of, we test 1,000 strains a week, right? So this is all scraped by, data and just by essentially quick functions. Now, what this does is you see a lot of indoor flower actually staggered and segmented into different qualities. So my indoor data scrapes here include the shake, include the small buds, as well as the large buds. So there's a huge amount of meh indoor flower that's dragging that overall average down based on how a large scale lab sees everything, because I test everything, right? Now, bear this in mind. For outdoor, you don't see that same level of segmentation. It's not so much top of the plant, middle of the plant, bottom of the plant. Outdoor, it's the whole plant ends up being really consistently chemically balanced, so to speak. That's because when you have to consider things like light energy in an indoor environment and how it affects the top of the plant versus the middle versus the bottom, it makes massive differences. However, when you consider how light energy works for outdoor, your light in a few feet worth of difference doesn't make or a few feet worth of difference, it doesn't make any big difference because your light bulb is 93 million miles away. So a few inches isn't going to change anything, right?
No.
So your distance light bulb right there, as interesting as it is going to affect the entire plant the same way. And you're not going to see that same segmentation that you would see in an indoor plant, where the way that light energy is emitted and hence hits the plant is completely different. Where a few feet make massive differences in light energy in an indoor environment, few feet doesn't mean squat in an outdoor environment. Hence, you have a much higher level of consistency, and you're able to see the results across our average tests of that consistency. Cool, huh?
That's very cool.
So what is our conclusion today? Virtually every consumer does not make intuitive decisions for their own consumption based on high THC. And trust me, I've given this, like I said, to plenty of rooms full of professionals. And I just make a, kind of an obvious observation. Who here, in the professional community of cannabis, workers and smokers woke up and then checked the jar to make sure that the THC was up to par before they smoked whatever they were smoking? No way. They smelled each one if they even needed to. They made a determination based on a mood, not based on a number. Nobody does that, at least not on the end that I talked to. Candace, yeah, I mean, you smoke just as much as ever, I'm guessing. And when was the last time that you let high THC actually not even just make a buying decision, just on what you were about to smoke at that moment? Nothing.
Yeah.
Zero bearing.
Taste and smell. Yeah.
100%. Being able to determine the quality of cannabis experience can be based through studying the THC to terp profile and ratio. And a scenario has unfolded in which consumers have been falsely suggested to with what to look for to determine high quality cannabis. This is a race to the bottom that needs to stop.
Yep.
And a little bit of information on my lab before I say goodbye, but feel free to let me know if you have any questions too. I saw something pop up in the chat right here from George Candace asking, will this be recorded and emailed? He had to step away and missed a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to send an email to everybody and they can rewatch on Vimeo and YouTube. This has been incredible information. I really love how you present everything that is like so high level and really easy to digest and remember and kind of help and spread the information to other people in a great manner like that. So thank you so much, Nate. We have a couple other questions. Can you stick around?
I saw that in the Q&A. Let me make sure I cover all of those. So a little while ago, sorry, it took me a minute to get to.
No
but
worries.
does the consistency degrade over time until it's spoiled like oranges? Yes, it does degrade. I wouldn't necessarily say, you know what, let me back up a little bit. Yes, it does degrade. It is possible to dry out oranges and to have, say, the equivalent of a dried fruit. That would be a little bit more closely related to how cannabis looks in certain forms. And just the same way that if you had a dry fruit that, was out for months, say, before it got sold, it would degrade heavily. And so in terms of something, even what it is and cured, very much so. I wouldn't say it spoils as much as it oxidizes.
Yeah.
And oxidizing, think of it as like a slow version of an apple turning brown, for instance. It won't taste as good, and chemically you won't get the same effects. It won't be the same experience. And so with consistency degrading in cannabis, it's typically it will destabilize from THCA, which is what you usually see it in from a raw plant. It'll destabilize to Delta 9, usually pretty significantly. After about 6 months, it'll destabilize about usually 25 to 30% into Delta 9 of the overall chemical consistency. And you'll start to see some of that after destabilizing into Delta 9 start to further destabilize into CBN. Question: does my cat like cannabis? Honestly, I try not to smoke out my animals. I notice that one of my cats, will come around when I'm smoking. I try to keep the smoke away from them, and one of them seems to, kind of leave the building. I've also got a dog. Dog generally doesn't like the smoke. She'll go to another room if I'm ever lighting up, even though I clean out the room and stuff. Obviously, dogs have super sensitive smells. She doesn't like it.
They're wondering why you're so popular with all animals circling around you.
I mean, I make it a point not to burn. I mean, right off camera, like there's multiple implements of destruction for dabbing that way and smoking this way. I keep a professional kind of frame, at least. From our friend in New Zealand, the message is, I'm involved in the illegal medical cannabis movement here in New Zealand. My own focus is in growing small scale, best organic cannabis I can, outdoors with big emphasis on soil quality. Love what I'm hearing so far. Most of the plants have very rich have a very rich and differing range in the terpene profile. The odd one has a very low terpene based on smell. So, or the odd one has very low terpenes based on smell. So I think you're mentioning that the volatile profile is how I would usually describe it, is not very, doesn't express very much. You know, in California, we usually just say something like it doesn't have much of a nose on it.
Yes.
My products, excuse me. My products are mainly oils and tinctures. My question is, does decarbing process destroy the terpene effect? It does, yes. Should I infuse some raw bud as well in the oil / alcohol to improve the terpene effect? You can. Loving this chat, by the way. Best yet. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. To your questions, does decarbing process destroy terpenes? Oh, hell yeah, it does. The one that I see most often right now is, has everybody heard of rosin? It's when you squeeze cannabis, or more frequently squeeze out water-based live hash, and you squeeze it in, and you squeeze it till an oil comes out. And this oil is absolutely the bee's knees to dab and smoke. It's amazing. So people have been taking this product, which is THCA. And if you ever, look at THCA, it's in a solid phase, as far as matter goes. If you look up pure THCA on a Google image search, you'll see crystals come up. It's, again, a solid phase of matter. Then if you consider what decarboxylated cannabis looks like, it's Delta 9. Delta 9, pure Delta 9 looks like cannabis distillate. If you were to do a Google search on that, you would see, albeit a very thick, but regardless, something in the liquid phase, a very thick oil. So liquid phase, decarbed, solid phase, not decarbed. Interestingly enough, and the reason I bring this up is because when people want to make rosin pens, they want to take this rosin stuff that's largely THCA. THCA is in a solid phase, right? They want to take something that's in this largely solid phase, and they want to make it so it works inside of a pen, which means you need to make it work in a liquid phase. People heat it up and decarboxylate it. As a result, what most people find out is that the rosin that comes through the pens in general, and on the far wide of the market, some people do it beautifully, but on the far side of the market, the rosin that comes from these pens isn't good. It's because people have absolutely nuked that terpene and otherwise a full volatile profile. Esters, terps, thiols, ketones, lactones, esters, everything, flavonoids, they have left the building. They got volatilized. They are no longer in there. Although you were able to heat up the product in order to decarboxylate it, you also effectively broke down a lot of what you were looking for inadvertently, not usually as per the case. So if you've ever had a rosin pen and it doesn't quite work, taste the same as you were expecting, it's because so much of the volatile profile was oxidized and evacuated when people heated it. Also bear in mind, if you're ever having a rosin pen, that the reason why somebody heated it up was to move things from solid to liquid phase. Hence, again, solid phase in cannabis is THCA. THCA is a crystal, solid phase, and decarboxylated cannabis, liquid, Delta 9, just like distillate.
Interesting. That's a good little gem right there for people.
All right. So does decarbing process destroy the terpene effect? Absolutely. You will change the chemical phase in a few different ways, but in doing so, you're heating it, right? And are you volatilizing these chemicals? Absolutely. How low of a temperature does cannabis start volatilizing at? In the 60s. Fahrenheit at least, so we're looking at extremely low temperatures right here where it volatilizes. If you're looking for evidence that cannabis will then volatilize at room temperature, smell a bag of cannabis. If you can smell something, that's chemicals volatilizing right there in real time, and you'll never get them back. Obviously, an accelerated version of these, especially when manufacturing things like oils and tinctures, per Annie's questions, does exist as well. She asks, should I infuse some raw bud as well in the oil alcohol to improve the terpene effect? There's some really interesting ways to go here. Some of the things that I've done is to get my hands on extracts, and some of the extracts I'll decarboxylate because I need Delta 9, and I'll withhold some of the extracts because even though they're high in THCA, which is actually a fantastic anti-inflammation chemical and anti-inflammatory, so I don't necessarily suggest staying away from THCA as well as Delta 9 for your overall formulation. What I also like there is that you'll be bringing in those virginal chemicals that you will not have had necessarily a chance to cook off. So should I infuse raw bud as well into it? You could, but you could also take some extract and have it decarb and other extract and don't decarb it and just have it 50-50. Could you infuse raw bud in the oil alcohol to improve the terpene effect? Yeah. You could also make a steam distillation. You could also have other methods of extractions, HTEs from the BHO process. There's the terp fraction that comes off of CO2. So if you do have access to other things, all of that's in the range of what you might be able to consider. But the idea of doing this, one more fun little anecdote. I have a friend who makes the, these rosin, smokable rosin in pens, and he lets everything, sit in a jar until you start to see a separation. You'll get a terpene heavy fraction from the cannabinoid heavy fraction sort of separating in a jar. You've seen this, right, Candace?
Mm-hmm.
What he'll do is he'll take that cannabinoid, he'll scrape the terpene fraction, keep that in the fridge, and take the cannabinoid heavy fraction, heat that and decarboxylate it. And post decarboxylation there, he takes the terpene fraction and mixes those two back together. All single source from the same plant, and he's mindful to not want to oxidize the more flavorful volatile chemicals. To everybody, if any type of approach like that would work for anyone, bear in mind that these are all options that we would have for the sake of rendering cannabis. Love that you asked that. That's one of my main jobs as the lab is actually helping people bridge the difference.
Make better products
to do. And so thank you for asking that. Yeah, I could answer those questions all night. So if you have any follow-up, please don't hesitate to let me know. I hope that was able to be nice and informative for you.
That's a great answer.
Does consistency change like wine every year? Great question. Not necessarily, mainly because wine doesn't use that much science in its process. Wine uses the idea of like having a master taster kind of thing and tasting crew. And so in that sense, not only will you see differences in terms of the outdoor conditions that everything grew, and which obviously has massive impact, but you also are noting that they don't actually use analytics to keep their process on. Now, the whole reason we're here having this discussion is because of analytics being used in cannabis, right? And being used right versus wrong and all of that stuff. Interestingly enough, other than just determining like amounts of ABV and stuff and just basic stuff they need to do for regulations, there's virtually no analytics in wine. It's all anecdotal. It's all by flavor.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of crazy. Yeah, right. I mean, so I've talked to a beer maker who was hanging out with a whiskey maker, and I don't know if I'm not part of this scene, but both of them were talking some pretty mad smack on winemakers in that conversation because they both have to keep their products on the rail. They were pretty much explaining on the rails using analytics and saying, well, these pesky winemakers just basically get to throw it back and say, oh, that tastes about right. Versus using analytics and saying like, no, this is exactly what people expect from us. We have to keep it, right in the line of expectations versus like, whatever happens. And so it's a difference in culture in manufacturing these. Kind of cool, kind of crazy.
Yeah, that is really interesting. The fact too that it can be based really on someone's perception and their, what qualities they like based, compared to like an analytical kind of, test result, that actually gauges quality and not just like one person's like preferences. So that's really interesting. Very interesting.
Other things that popped up in the chat. There's a mention everyone should read Ethan Russo's white paper, Taming THC and the Entourage Effects of Terpenes or Terpenoids from 2011. He's actually who coined the phrase, entourage effect, which we covered earlier in this lecture. And while I know that paper and couldn't agree more with that statement right there, everybody should know. Everybody should be familiar with it. If I recall, it's only about 60 pages. It's a pretty easy read. 100% get into that because that gives you a fantastic level of optics at cannabis. Although I do want to just point out that part of this lecture is to suggest that while that is an absolute cornerstone and building block in cannabis education, taming THC does still put a huge amount of attention on THC, whereas the idea of, and again, this is just conceptual, and so just these ideas, but the idea of an ensemble effect is something that's very much more able to be something that's an ensemble effect is something that's much more able to be embraced in terms of, I think, and where a lot of the, like I said, it's kind of cannabis loving professional community feels like it should go. Stop taking the attention off from, stop putting attention on THC, stop just hyper focusing on it. And in so many ways, yes, that's an amazing paper and it explains THC so well, but we're here to explain every last part of the plant. And that's just kind of where I would leave that. And again, that's an amazing comment. I can't recommend reading enough on cannabis. Please do check out Taming THC.
Yeah, there's a lot of information for continuing education to continue to learn more about cannabis. I have one question. Can you talk a little bit about your focus group and how many individuals you used, and if you're going to be doing any other kind of studies like that in the future?
I hope to, and I realize that it's fortunately a very big stick I can swing right there. So I've got so many projects and things that I'm working on, and I'm hoping to be able to see that through to its real opportunity in terms of gaining new information and data. I've got the ideas out there to a few people, so we'll hope for it. What can I say about it? It was a 21-person focus group, tested 8 different strains over the course of 4 hours. Which a lot of people would think like, hey, if I'm testing, the equivalent of, and every person had a chance to smoke 1 to 1.5 grams. And if you're thinking that, smoking across all of that cannabis and, having to do a different strain every 30 minutes, pretty much like clockwork, would be difficult. And I thought it would be. And I honestly didn't expect to see the level of rigid consistency that I did. Let me explain. Obviously, there were there were 4 different farms in the main study that I did. That's the one with the 21 people. There were 4 different farms represented. Obviously, I didn't want to do the lazy thing and just have people smoke, 2 from one farm, 2 from the next farm, 2 from the farm after that, and so forth. I mixed them up, right? As you know, and as I saw even in your poll, you mentioned, what do people sometimes look for? And what some of those are by a certain farm operation, by a certain grower or so forth, right? In this sense, it's very much that, you find a lot of consistency in terms of how things are grown from a certain operation. And to the listeners here, that's probably not that much of a surprise. You know that certain operations tend to generally be high-end operations and certain operations tend to be mid-end and so forth. What I found in the ratings, even though I staggered and mixed around the farms, is that people's ratings lined up almost like clockwork, exactly almost over the farm itself. So farms that had the ability to make a terpier strain and stuff like that was rated a certain way. It wasn't just one strain. It was generally all their offerings that were terpier.
Wow.
And so even though I mixed up the different farms across, you could actually see just by ratings alone, it regrouped the farms just by ratings alone. So I didn't expect it to be that effective. You know what I mean? I expected it to be all over the place. And I expected, especially as people smoked, 8 strains over 4 hours, I'm like, I know that would make me kind of loopy in some ways and I'd be having a good time, but I would maybe doubt my own abilities, but everybody stayed on top of it. And not only were they able to stay on top of it, all of the results that I was able to draw from after I amassed the results basically told the story, like it all being consistent within certain THC to terp ratios, like it being all consistent and locked in within certain farms. All of that, it told such an amazing story. Also, there were numerous operations that were planning on abandoning. They actually, because I tested everything and then I didn't tell anybody what the results were, and then I blind tested everybody, and then I told everybody what they were smoking afterwards, and had my whole reveal kind of thing. And in that, I had the opportunity to get a little bit of feedback from the people who submitted stuff, and they were actually kind of blown away because there were multiple strains that people were thinking like, oh man, this hit 20, 21%, but then they scored super high in terms of the ratings of the focus group. And that blew their minds because they're like, wow, this is, what do I even do now? Like, what everybody loves is going to be super difficult for me to sell, because how do I tell somebody that 20, 21% stuff is there? And that leads to kind of an understanding that maybe something like focus groups, until we get a more robust chemical understanding and profiling of cannabis, maybe something like focus group ratings ought to be a part of the overall rating consideration process. For now, though, even that would be considered ahead of its time. We could simply jump to what information I was able to prove through this by simply looking at and reviewing THC to terp profiles.
That's really cool. I'm so glad that you took the initiative to do this study. It's something that you guys don't have to do just to, perform regular business, but it's something that you're doing to help like advance the cannabis community. And it's like the right thing to do. So I'm really happy that you did that. And I'm really happy that you're on this mission to kind of, correct the general consumers and let them know that, high THC isn't where it's all at. It drives me crazy. Like I talked about before, I'll show someone maybe 3 or 4 different things. I'll be like, this one's nice. I'm smoking on this right now. It has a great terpene profile. And they're like, that's great. Which one has the highest THC? And so it just drives me crazy. And so we're on this mission together. And I hope that everybody has really enjoyed this presentation and gleaned some new nuggets of cannabis information and, really just like understands the plant a little bit more. So appreciative of you being with us today, Nate.
No problem. There is one more question that popped in
Yes.
from Annie, which I think is relevant. She said, we haven't touched on CBD, CBG, et cetera. I assume terpenes are equally important here. Everything I'm basing this off of so far is data. And man, I wish I had enough good data to actually answer your question, Annie. People are throwing, THC out of I get 1,000 strains a week to test. 999 of them are high THC. I don't have the data that I need. This data that I'm able to share with you is like hard data that I'm able to confidently report back to you on based on what I observe and based on what correlates through my studies and what have you. For things like CBD, CBG, yes, they're important, but I believe terpenes, just like other volatile compounds and other active compounds inside of our favorite plant, are important. But I would relish the opportunity to be able to study these on the same level, just based on the numbers and understanding and confidence that I can present to you guys tonight. In other words, could people please start growing these and testing it so I can get more data? Because that would be fantastic. In general, what we would say about CBD in the most studied, understood area are the ratios of THC to CBD. And I would love to see people popularize the use of high CBD, CBD-rich strains. Personally, as a daily cannabis consumer, I love one-to-ones. I would love to see more of those in the market. And in fact, one-to-ones are insanely difficult to come across, and especially in any real diversity there. When we want to look at diversity of being the same cannabinoid profile, that's where the volatile profiles really kick in. But now at this point, outside of THC, we're not really seeing that much diversity. So unfortunately, a lack of data. Although you can assume, per your question, that terpenes are equally important there. We just don't 100% understand it. I would still, however, in terms of never wanting to talk about what I don't know, I would still refer to them as active compounds within the plant.
Yeah. Glass House has a Tangelo Flow, a 1-to-1 that is really nice. I really enjoy that as well during the day. I just want to kind of release and, reduce a little anxiety and relax, but I don't want to be like too kind of foggy. If I have something important to do, it's just like a nice kind of like chill out kind of feeling that you get. So again, I agree. I love those 1-to-1s, especially during the daytime.
Send it my way, Candace. And thank you for all the kind words before I jumped in with, the mention of that last question right there. Thank you. I'm happy to be here for you guys whenever you need me and answer all those, hard to reach questions and stuff. So thank you guys. Really appreciate you being here with me and asking all the awesome questions and all the awesome engagement and stuff like that. So had some of my contact information there. Please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'm on it pretty much every minute of every day. So happy to help however I can.
Thank you so much, Nate. This has been wonderful. I really, really enjoyed this. I'm so appreciative of you sharing your information and putting this wonderful presentation together for us. I want to thank all of our guests for being with us here today, and to Nate's team too at BelCosta Labs for helping make this possible. I hope that we were able to share some information that will help you all become better informed cannabis consumers, and that the information that we've shared will help you find relief. With that, I look forward to seeing you guys for another episode of the Pharmacy Cannabis or Friends of the Farm lecture series. And we look forward to having you back again, Nate, to maybe talk about some of your other focus groups and research that you're working on in the future.
Yeah, it's so much of it. And, this is actually really the only really fun area of it. Most of what I do, I feel like, is doomsday sayings. So, you know what I mean? It usually has to do, unfortunately, with all the stuff that can go wrong with cannabis. So maybe that's the idea for the next one is, some of those hard hitting realities that unfortunately I get to participate in.
I love that. I think that's a great idea. Thank you again for all your time today and being wonderful and advocating for the cannabis industry.
Always. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Candace. We'll catch up soon.
Yeah, definitely. I'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Bye, guys.